Chapter 8 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Caroline Hemmerly Kunkel, Columbus, Ohio. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 8 The Chateau d'If. The commissary of police, as he traversed the antechamber, made a sign to two gendarmes, who placed themselves one on Dantès' right and the other on his left. A door that communicated with the Palais de Justice was opened, and they went through a long range of gloomy corridors, whose appearance might have made even the boldest shudder. The Palais de Justice communicated with the prison, a sombre edifice that from its grated windows looks on the clock tower of the École. After numberless windings, Dantès saw a door with an iron wicket. The commissary took up an iron mallet and knocked thrice, every blow seeming to Dantès as if struck on his heart. The door opened, the two gendarmes gently pushed him forward, and the door closed with a loud sound behind him. The air he inhaled was no longer pure, but thick and mephitic. He was in prison. He was conducted to a tolerably neat chamber, but grated and barred, and its appearance, therefore, did not greatly alarm him. Besides, the words of Villefort, who seemed to interest himself so much, resounded still in his ears like a promise of freedom. It was 4 o'clock when Dantès was placed in this chamber. It was, as we have said, the 1st of March, and the prisoner was soon buried in darkness. The obscurity augmented the acuteness of his hearing. At the slightest sound he rose and hastened to the door, convinced they were about to liberate him, but the sound died away, and Dantès sank again into his seat. At last, about 10 o'clock, and just as Dantès began to despair, steps were heard in the corridor, a key turned in the lock, and the bolts creaked. The massy oaken door flew open, and a flood of light from 2 torches pervaded the apartment. By the torchlight Dantès saw the glittering sabre and carbines of 4 gendarmes. He had advanced at first, but stopped at the sight of this display of force. "Are you come to fetch me?" he asked. "Yes," replied a gendarme. "By the orders of the deputy procureur?" "I believe so." The conviction that they came from M. de Villefort relieved all Dantès' apprehensions. He advanced calmly, and placed himself in the centre of the escort. A carriage waited at the door, the coachman was at the box, and a police officer sat beside him. "Is this carriage for me?" said Dantès. "It is for you," replied a gendarme. Dantès was about to speak, but feeling himself urged forward, and having neither the power nor the intention to resist, he mounted the steps, and was in an instant seated inside between 2 gendarmes. The 2 others took their places opposite, and the carriage rolled heavily over the stones. The prisoner glanced at the windows. They were grated. He had changed his prison for another, that was conveying him he knew not whither. Through the grating, however, Dantès saw they were passing through the Rue Caisserie, and by the Rue Saint Laurent and the Rue Taramis to the port. Soon he saw the lights of La Cassagne. The carriage stopped. The officer descended, approached the guardhouse. A dozen soldiers came out and formed themselves in order. Dantès saw the reflection of their muskets by the light of the lamps on the quay. "Can all this force be summoned on my account?" thought he. The officer opened the door, which was locked, and, without speaking a word, answered Dantès' question, for he saw between the ranks of the soldiers a passage formed from the carriage to the port. The 2 gendarmes who were opposite to him descended first. Then he was ordered to alight, and the gendarmes on each side of him followed his example. They advanced towards a boat, which a custom-house officer held by a chain near the quay. The soldiers looked at Dantès with an air of stupid curiosity. In an instant he was placed in the stern sheets of the boat, between the gendarmes, while the officer stationed himself at the bow. A shove sent the boat adrift, and 4 sturdy oarsmen impelled it rapidly toward the pylon. At a shout from the boat, the chain that closes the mouth of the port was lowered, and in a second they were, as Dantès knew, in the Frioul and outside the inner harbor. The prisoner's first feeling was of joy at again breathing the pure air, for air is freedom. But he soon sighed, for he passed before La Réserve, where he had that morning been so happy, and now through the open windows came the laughter and revelry of a ball. Dantès folded his hands and raised his eyes to the heaven, and prayed fervently. The boat continued her voyage. They had passed the Tête de Mort, were now off the Once de Ferro and about to double the battery. This maneuver was incomprehensible to Dantès. "Whither are you taking me?" asked he. "You will soon know." "But still—" "We are forbidden to give you any explanation." Dantès, trained in discipline, knew that nothing would be more absurd than to question subordinates, who were forbidden to reply, and so he remained silent. The most vague and wild thoughts passed through his mind. The boat they were in could not make a long voyage. There was no vessel at anchor outside the harbor, he thought. Perhaps they were going to leave him on some distant point. He was not bound, nor had they made any attempt to handcuff him. This seemed a good augury. Besides, had not the deputy, who had been so kind to him, told him that provided he did not pronounce the dreaded name of Noirtier, he had nothing to apprehend? Had not Villefort in his presence destroyed the fatal letter, the only proof against him? He waited silently, striving to pierce through the darkness. They had left the Isle Ratonneau, where the lighthouse stood, on the right, and they were now opposite the Point de Catalan. It seemed to the prisoner that he could distinguish a feminine form on the beach, for it was there Mercédès dwelt. How was it that presentiment did not warn Mercédès that her lover was within 300 yards of her? One light alone was visible, and Dantès saw that it came from Mercédès' chamber. Mercédès was the only one awake in the whole settlement. A loud cry could be heard by her, but pride restrained him, and he did not utter it. What would his guards think if they heard him shout like a madman? He remained silent, his eyes fixed upon the light. The boat went on, but the prisoner thought only of Mercédès. An intervening elevation of land hid the light. Dantès turned and perceived that they had got out to sea. While he had been absorbed in thought, they had shipped their oars and hoisted sail. The boat was now moving with the wind. In spite of his repugnance to address the guards, Dantès turned to the nearest gendarme, and taking his hand, "Comrade," said he, "I adjure you, as a Christian and a sailor, to tell me where we are going. I am Captain Dantès, a loyal Frenchman, though accused of treason. Tell me where you are conducting me, and I promise you on my honor I will submit to my fate." The gendarme looked irresolutely at his companion, who returned for answer a sign that said, "I see no great harm in telling him now," and the gendarme replied, "You are a native of Marseilles, and a sailor, and yet you do not know where you are going?" "On my honor, I have no idea." "Have you no idea whatever?" "None at all." "That is impossible." "I swear to you it is true. Tell me, I entreat." "But my orders—" "Your orders do not forbid your telling me what I must know in 10 minutes, in half an hour, or an hour. You see I cannot escape, even if I intended." "Unless you are blind, or have never been outside the harbor, you must know." "I do not." "Look round you, then." Dantès rose and looked forward, when he saw rise within 100 yards of him the black and frowning rock on which stands the Château d'If. This gloomy fortress, which has for more than 300 years furnished food for so many wild legends, seemed to Dantès like a scaffold to a malefactor. "The Château d'If?" cried he. "What are we going there for?" The gendarme smiled. "I am not going there to be imprisoned," said Dantès. "It is only used for political prisoners. I have committed no crime. Are there any magistrates or judges at the Château d'If?" "There are only," said the gendarme, "a governor, a garrison, turnkeys, and good thick walls. Come, come, do not look so astonished, or you will make me think you are laughing at me in return for my good nature." Dantès pressed the gendarme's hand as though he would crush it. "You think, then," said he, "that I am taken to the Château d'If to be imprisoned there?" "It is probable, but there is no occasion to squeeze so hard." "Without any injury, without any formality?" "All the formalities have been gone through. The inquiry is already made." "And so, in spite of M. de Villefort's promises?" "I do not know what M. de Villefort promised you," said the gendarme, "but I know we are taking you to the Château d'If. But what are you doing? Help, comrades, help!" By a rapid movement, which the gendarme's practiced eye had perceived, Dantès sprang forward to precipitate himself into the sea. But 4 vigorous arms seized him as his feet quitted the bottom of the boat. He fell back cursing with rage. "Good," said the gendarme, placing his knee on his chest. "Believe soft-spoken gentlemen again. Hark ye, my friend, I have disobeyed my first order, but I will not disobey the second, and if you move, I will blow your brains out." And he leveled his carbine at Dantès, who felt the muzzle against his temple. For a moment the idea of struggling crossed his mind, and of so ending the unexpected evil that had overtaken him. but he bethought him of M. de Villefort's promise, and besides, death in a boat from the hand of a gendarme seemed too terrible. He remained motionless, but gnashing his teeth and wringing his hands with fury. At this moment the boat came to a landing with a violent shock. One of the sailors leaped on shore, and a cord creaked as it ran through a pulley, and Dantès guessed they were on the end of the voyage, and that they were mooring the boat. His guards, taking him by the arms and coat collar, forced him to rise and dragged him towards the steps that lead to the gate of the fortress, while the police officer carrying a musket with fixed bayonet followed behind. Dantès made no resistance. He was like a man in a dream. He saw soldiers drawn up on the embankment. He knew vaguely that he was ascending a flight of steps. He was conscious that he passed through a door and that the door closed behind him, but all this indistinctly as through a mist. He did not even see the ocean, that terrible barrier against freedom, which the prisoners look upon with utter despair. They halted for a minute, during which he strove to collect his thoughts. He looked around. He was in a court surrounded by high walls. He heard the measured tread of sentinels. As they passed through the light, he saw the barrels of their muskets shine. They waited upwards of 10 minutes. Certain Dantès could not escape, the gendarmes released him. They seemed awaiting orders. The orders came. "Where is the prisoner?" said a voice. "Here," replied the gendarmes. "Let him follow me. I will take him to the cell." "Go," said the gendarmes, thrusting Dantès forward. The prisoner followed his guide, who led him into a room almost underground, whose bare and reeking walls seemed as though impregnated with tears. A lamp placed on a stool illumined the apartment faintly, and showed Dantès the features of his conductor, an under-jailer, ill-clothed and of sullen appearance. "Here is your chamber for tonight," said he. "It is late, and the governor is asleep. Tomorrow, perhaps he may change you. In the meantime there is bread, water, and fresh straw, and that is all a prisoner can ask for. Good night." And before Dantès could open his mouth, before he had noticed where the jailer placed his bread or the water, before he had glanced towards the corner where the straw was, the jailer disappeared, taking with him the lamp and closing the door, leaving stamped upon the prisoner's mind the dim reflection of the dripping walls of his dungeon. Dantès was alone in darkness and in silence, cold as the shadows that he felt breathe on his burning forehead. With the first dawn of the day the jailer returned, with orders to leave Dantès where he was. He found the prisoner in the same position, as if fixed there, his eyes swollen with weeping. He had passed the night standing, and without sleep. The jailer advanced. Dantès appeared not to perceive him. He touched him on the shoulder. Edmond started. "Have you not slept?" said the jailer. "I do not know," replied Dantès. The jailer stared. "Are you hungry?" continued he. "I do not know." "Do you wish for anything?" "I wish to see the governor." The jailer shrugged his shoulders and left the chamber. Dantès followed him with his eyes, and stretched forth his hands towards the open door, but the door closed. All his emotion then burst forth. He cast himself on the ground, weeping bitterly, and asking himself what crime he had committed that he was thus punished. The day passed thus. He scarcely tasted food, but walked round and round the cell like a wild beast in its cage. One thought in particular tormented him, namely, that during his journey hither he had sat so still, whereas he might, a dozen times, have plunged into the sea, and thanks to his powers of swimming, for which he was famous, have gained the shore, concealed himself until the arrival of a Genoese or Spanish vessel, escaped to Spain or Italy, where Mercédès and his father could have joined him. He had no fears as to how he should live. Good seamen are welcome everywhere. He spoke Italian like a Tuscan, and Spanish like a Castilian. He would have been free and happy with Mercédès and his father, whereas he was now confined in the Château d'If, that impregnable fortress, ignorant of the future destiny of his father and Mercédès. And all this because he had trusted to Villefort's promise. The thought was maddening, and Dantès threw himself furiously down on his straw. The next morning at the same hour the jailer came again. "Well," said the jailer, "are you more reasonable today?" Dantès made no reply. "Come, cheer up. Is there anything that I can do for you?" "I wish to see the governor." "I have already told you it was impossible." "Why so?" "Because it is against prison rules, and prisoners must not even ask for it." "What is allowed, then?" "Better fare, if you pay for it, books, and leave to walk about." "I do not want books. I am satisfied with my food, and do not care to walk about. But I wish to see the governor." "If you worry me by repeating the same thing, I will not bring you any more to eat." "Well, then," said Edmond, "if you do not, I shall die of hunger, that is all." The jailer saw by his tone he would be happy to die, and as every prisoner was worth 10 sous a day to his jailer, he replied in a more subdued tone: "What you ask is impossible, but if you are very well behaved you will be allowed to walk about, and some day you will meet the governor, and if he chooses to reply, that is his affair." "But," asked Dantès, "how long shall I have to wait?" "Ah, a month, 6 months, a year." "It is too long a time. I wish to see him at once." "Ah," said the jailer, "do not always brood over what is impossible, or you will be mad in a fortnight." "You think so?" "Yes. We have an instance here. It was by always offering 1,000,000 of francs to the governor for his liberty that an abbé became mad, who was in this chamber before you." "How long has he left it?" "2 years." "Was he liberated then?" "No, he was put in a dungeon." "Listen," said Dantès, "I am not an abbé, I am not mad; perhaps I shall be, but at present, unfortunately, I am not. I will make you another offer." "What is that?" "I do not offer you 1,000,000, because I have it not, but I will give you 100 crowns if, the first time you go to Marseilles, you will seek out a young girl named Mercédès, at the Catalan, and give her 2 lines for me." "If I took them and were detected, I should lose my place, which is worth 2,000 francs a year, so that I should be a great fool to run such a risk for 300. "Well," said Dantès, "mark this: if you refuse at least to tell Mercédès I am here, I will some day hide myself behind the door, and when you enter I will dash out your brains with this stool." "Threats!" cried the jailer, retreating and putting himself on the defensive. "You are certainly going mad. The abbé began like you, and in 3 days you will be like him, mad enough to tie up. But, fortunately, there are dungeons here." Dantès whirled the stool round his head. All right," said the jailer. "All right, since you will have it so, I will send word to the governor." "Very well," replied Dantès, dropping the stool and sitting on it as if he were in reality mad. The jailer went out and returned in an instant with the corporal and 4 soldiers. "By the governor's orders," said he, "conduct the prisoner to the tier beneath." "To the dungeon, then," said the corporal. "Yes, we must put the madman with the madmen." The soldiers seized Dantès, who followed passively. He descended 15 steps, and the door of a dungeon was opened, and he was thrust in. The door closed, and Dantès advanced with outstretched hands until he touched the wall. He then sat down in the corner until his eyes became accustomed to the darkness. The jailer was right. Dantès wanted but little of being utterly mad. End of chapter 8. Recording by Caroline Hemmerly Kunkel, Columbus, Ohio.
Chapter 9 of The Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 9. The Evening of the Betrothal. Villefort had, as we have said, hastened back to Madame de Saint-Méran in the Place du Grand Cour, and on entering the house found that the guests whom he had left at table were taking coffee in the salon. Renée was, with all the rest of the company, anxiously awaiting him, and his entrance was followed by a great exclamation. "Well, decapitator, guardian of the state, royalist, Brutus, what is the matter?" said one. "Speak out." "Are we threatened with a fresh reign of terror?" asked another. "Has the Corsican ogre broken loose?" cried a third. "Marquise," said Villefort, approaching his future mother-in-law, "I request your pardon for thus leaving you. Will the marquis honor me by a few moments' private conversation?" "Ah, it is really a serious matter, then?" asked the marquis, remarking the cloud on Villefort's brow. "So serious that I must take leave of you for a few days. So," added he, turning to Renée, "judge for yourself if it be not important." "You are going to leave us?" cried Renée, unable to hide her emotion at this unexpected announcement. "Alas," returned Villefort, "I must." "Where, then, are you going?" asked the marquise. "That, madame, is an official secret; but if you have any commissions for Paris, a friend of mine is going there tonight, and will with pleasure undertake them." The guests looked at each other. "You wish to speak to me alone?" said the marquis. "Yes, let us go to the library, please." The marquis took his arm, and they left the salon. "Well," asked he, as soon as they were by themselves, "tell me what it is." "An affair of the greatest importance that demands my immediate presence in Paris. Now, excuse the indiscretion, marquis, but have you any landed property?" All my fortune is in the funds, 700 or 800,000 francs. Then sell out, Marquis, or you will lose it all." "But how can I sell out here?" "You have a broker, have you not?" "Yes." "Then give me a letter to him, and tell him to sell out without an instant's delay. Perhaps even now I shall arrive too late." "The deuce you say!" replied the marquis. "Let us lose no time then." And sitting down, he wrote a letter to his broker, ordering him to sell out at the market price. "Now then," said Villefort, placing the letter in his pocket-book, "I must have another." "To whom?" "To the king." "To the king?" "Yes. I dare not write to his majesty." "I do not ask you to write to his majesty, but ask M. de Salvieux to do so. I want a letter that will enable me to reach the king's presence without all the formalities of demanding an audience. That would occasion a loss of precious time." "But address yourself to the keeper of seals. He has the right of entry at the Tuileries, and can procure you audience at any hour of the day or night." "Doubtless, but there is no occasion to divide the honors of my discovery with him. The keeper would leave me in the background, and take all the glory to himself. I tell you, marquis, my fortune is made if I only reach the Tuileries the first, for the king will not forget the service I do him. In that case go and get ready. I will call Salvieux and make him write the letter. Be as quick as possible, I must be on the road in a quarter of an hour. Tell your coachman to stop at the door. You will present my excuses to the marquise and Mademoiselle Renée, whom I leave on such a day with great regret. You will find them both here, and can make your farewells in person. A thousand thanks. And now for the letter." The marquis rang. A servant entered. "Say to the Comte de Salvieux that I would like to see him." "Now then, go," said the marquis. "I shall be gone only a few moments." Villefort hastily quitted the apartment, but reflecting that the sight of the deputy procureur running through the streets would be enough to throw the whole city into confusion, he resumed his ordinary pace. At his door he perceived a figure in the shadow that seemed to wait for him. It was Mercédès, who, hearing no news of her lover, had come unobserved to inquire after him. As Villefort drew near, she advanced and stood before him. Dantès had spoken of Mercédès, and Villefort instantly recognized her. Her beauty and high bearing surprised him, and when she inquired what had become of her lover, it seemed to him that she was the judge and he the accused. "The young man you speak of," said Villefort abruptly, "is a great criminal, and I can do nothing for him, mademoiselle." Mercédès burst into tears, and as Villefort strove to pass her, again addressed him. "But at least tell me where he is, that I may know whether he is alive or dead," said she. "I do not know; he is no longer in my hands," replied Villefort. And desirous of putting an end to the interview, he pushed by her, and closed the door, as if to exclude the pain he felt. But remorse is not thus banished. Like Virgil's wounded hero, he carried the arrow in his wound, and arrived at the salon, Villefort uttered a sigh that was almost a sob, and sank into a chair. Then the first pangs of an unending torture seized upon his heart. The man he sacrificed to his ambition, that innocent victim immolated on the altar of his father's faults, appeared to him pale and threatening, leading his affianced bride by the hand, and bringing with him remorse, not such as the ancients figured, furious and terrible, but that slow and consuming agony whose pangs are intensified from hour to hour up to the very moment of death. Then he had a moment's hesitation. He had frequently called for capital punishment on criminals, and owing to his irresistible eloquence they had been condemned, and yet the slightest shadow of remorse had never clouded Villefort's brow, because they were guilty. At least he believed so. But here was an innocent man whose happiness he had destroyed. In this case he was not the judge, but the executioner. As he thus reflected, he felt the sensation we have described, and which had hitherto been unknown to him, arise in his bosom, and fill him with vague apprehensions. It is thus that a wounded man trembles instinctively at the approach of the finger to his wound until it be healed. But Villefort's was one of those that never close, or if they do, only close to reopen more agonizing than ever. If at this moment the sweet voice of Renée had sounded in his ears pleading for mercy, or the fair Mercédès had entered and said, "In the name of God, I conjure you to restore me my affianced husband," his cold and trembling hands would have signed his release, but no voice broke the stillness of the chamber, and the door was opened only by Villefort's valet, who came to tell him that the travelling carriage was in readiness. Villefort rose, or rather sprang from his chair, hastily opened one of the drawers of his desk, emptied all the gold it contained into his pocket, stood motionless an instant, his hand pressed to his head, muttered a few inarticulate sounds, and then, perceiving that his servant had placed his cloak on his shoulders, he sprang into the carriage, ordering the postilions to drive to Madame de Saint Méran. The hapless Dantès was doomed. As the marquis had promised, Villefort found the marquise and Renée in waiting. He started when he saw Renée, for he fancied she was again about to plead for Dantès. Alas, her emotions were wholly personal; she was thinking only of Villefort's departure. She loved Villefort, and he left her at the moment he was about to become her husband. Villefort knew not when he should return, and Renée, far from pleading for Dantès, hated the man whose crime separated her from her lover. Meanwhile, what of Mercédès? She had met Fernand at the corner of the Rue de la Loge. She had returned to the Catalans, and had despairingly cast herself on her couch. Fernand, kneeling by her side, took her hand and covered it with kisses that Mercédès did not even feel. She passed the night thus. The lamp went out for want of oil, but she paid no heed to the darkness, and dawn came, but she knew not that it was day. Grief had made her blind to all but one object, that was Edmond. "Ah, there you are," said she at length, turning towards Fernand. "I have not quitted you since yesterday," returned Fernand sorrowfully. M. Morrel had not readily given up the fight. He had learned that Dantès had been taken to prison, and he had gone to all his friends and the influential persons of the city, but the report was already in circulation that Dantès was arrested as a Bonapartist agent, and as the most sanguine looked upon any attempt of Napoleon to remount the throne as impossible, he met with nothing but refusal, and had returned home in despair, declaring that the matter was serious, and that nothing more could be done. Caderousse was equally restless and uneasy, but instead of seeking, like M. Morrel, to aid Dantès, he had shut himself up with 2 bottles of black currant brandy, in the hope of drowning reflection. But he did not succeed, and became too intoxicated to fetch any more drink, and yet not so intoxicated as to forget what had happened. With his elbows on the table, he sat between the 2 empty bottles, while spectres danced in the light of the unsnuffed candle, spectres such as Hoffmann strews over his punch-drenched pages, like black fantastic dust. Danglars alone was content and joyous. He had got rid of an enemy, and made his own situation on the Pharaon secure. Danglars was one of those men born with a pen behind the ear, and an inkstand in the place of a heart. Everything with him was multiplication or subtraction. The life of a man was to him of far less value than a numeral, especially when, by taking it away, he could increase the sum total of his own desires. He went to bed at his usual hour, and slept in peace. Villefort, after having received M. de Salvieux's letter, embraced Renée, kissed the marquise's hand, and shaken that of the marquis, started for Paris along the Aix road. Old Dantès was dying with anxiety to know what had become of Edmond, but we know very well what had become of Edmond. End of chapter 9.
Chapter 10 of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 10. The King's Closet at the Tuileries. We will leave Villefort on the road to Paris, travelling, thanks to trebled fees, with all speed, and passing through 2 or 3 apartments, enter at the Tuileries the little room with the arched window, so well known as having been the favorite closet of Napoleon and Louis XVIII., and now Louis Philippe. There, seated before a walnut table he had brought with him from Hartwell, and to which, from one of those fancies not uncommon to great people, he was particularly attached, the king, Louis XVIII., was carelessly listening to a man of 50 or 52 years of age, with gray hair, aristocratic bearing, and exceedingly gentlemanly attire. and meanwhile making a marginal note in a volume of Gryphius's rather inaccurate but much sought after edition of Horace, a work which was much indebted to the sagacious observations of the philosophical monarch. "You say, sir," said the king, "that I am exceedingly disquieted, sire. Really, have you had a vision of the 7 fat kine and the 7 lean kine?" "No, sire, for that would only betoken for us 7 years of plenty and 7 years of scarcity; and with a king as full of foresight as your majesty, scarcity is not a thing to be feared." "Then of what other scourge are you afraid, my dear Blacas?" "Sire, I have every reason to believe that a storm is brewing in the south." "Well, my dear duke," replied Louis XVIII., "I think you are wrongly informed, and know positively that, on the contrary, it is very fine weather in that direction." Man of ability as he was, Louis XVIII. liked a pleasant jest. "Sire," continued M. de Blacas, "if it only be to reassure a faithful servant, will your majesty send into Languedoc, Provence, and Dauphine trusty men who will bring you back a faithful report as to the feeling in these 3 provinces?" "Caninus Surdus," replied the king, continuing the annotations in his Horace. "Sire," replied the courtier, laughing, in order that he might seem to comprehend the quotation, "your majesty may be perfectly right in relying on the good feeling of France, but I fear I am not altogether wrong in dreading some desperate attempt." "By whom?" "By Bonaparte, or at least by his adherents." "My dear Blacas," said the king, "you with your alarms prevent me from working." "And you, sire, prevent me from sleeping with your security. Wait, my dear sir, wait a moment, for I have such a delightful note on the pastor quum traherit. Wait, and I will listen to you afterwards." There was a brief pause, during which Louis XVIII. wrote, in a hand as small as possible, another note on the margin of his Horace, and then looking at the duke with the air of a man who thinks he has an idea of his own, while he is only commenting upon the idea of another, said, "Go on, my dear duke, go on. I listen." "Sire," said Blacas, who had for a moment the hope of sacrificing Villefort to his own profit, "I am compelled to tell you that these are not mere rumors destitute of foundation, which thus disquiet me, but a serious-minded man, deserving all my confidence, and charged by me to watch over the south," the duke hesitated as he pronounced these words, "has arrived by post to tell me that a great peril threatens the king, and so I hasten to you, sire." "Maladucus avidomum," continued Louis XVIII., still annotating. "Does your majesty wish me to drop the subject?" "By no means, my dear duke, but just stretch out your hand." "Which?" "Whichever you please; there, to the left." "Here, sire?" "I tell you to the left, and you are looking to the right." "I mean on my left. Yes, there. You will find yesterday's report of the minister of police. But here's M. Dandré himself." And M. Dandré, announced by the chamberlain in waiting, entered. "Come in," said Louis XVIII., with a repressed smile; "come in, baron, and tell the duke all you know, the latest news of M. de Bonaparte. Do not conceal anything, however serious. Let us see. The island of Elba is a volcano, and we may expect to have issuing thence flaming and bristling war. Bella, horrida, bella." M. Dandré leaned very respectfully on the back of a chair with his 2 hands, and said, "Has your majesty perused yesterday's report?" "Yes, yes; but tell the duke himself, who cannot find anything, what the report contains. Give him the particulars of what the usurper is doing in his islet." "Monsieur," said the baron to the duke, "all the servants of his majesty must approve of the latest intelligence which we have from the island of Elba." "Bonaparte." M. Dandré looked at Louis XVIII., who, employed in writing a note, did not even raise his head. "Bonaparte," continued the baron, "is mortally wearied, and passes whole days in watching his miners at work at Porto Longone." "And scratches himself for amusement," added the king. "Scratches himself?" inquired the duke. "What does your majesty mean?" "Yes, indeed, my dear duke. Did you forget that this great man, this hero, this demigod, is attacked with a malady of the skin which worries him to death, prurigo. And moreover, my dear duke," continued the minister of police, "we are almost assured that in a very short time the usurper will be insane." "Insane?" "Raving mad. His head becomes weaker. Sometimes he weeps bitterly, sometimes laughs boisterously. At other times he passes hours on the seashore, flinging stones in the water; and when the flint makes duck and drake 5 or 6 times, he appears as delighted as if he had gained another Marengo or Austerlitz. Now you must agree that these are indubitable symptoms of insanity." "Or of wisdom, my dear baron, or of wisdom," said Louis XVIII., laughing. "The greatest captains of antiquity amused themselves by casting pebbles into the ocean. See Plutarch's Life of Scipio Africanus." M. de Blacas pondered deeply between the confident monarch and the truthful minister. Villefort, who did not choose to reveal the whole secret, lest another should reap all the benefit of the disclosure, had yet communicated enough to cause him the greatest uneasiness. "Well, well, Dandré," said Louis XVIII., "Blacas is not yet convinced. Let us proceed, therefore, to the usurper's conversion." The minister of police bowed. "The usurper's conversion!" murmured the duke, looking at the king and Dandré, who spoke alternately like Virgil's shepherds. "The usurper converted?" "Decidedly, my dear duke." "In what way converted?" "To good principles. Tell him all about it, baron." "Why, this is the way of it," said the minister, with the gravest air in the world. "Napoleon lately had a review, and as 2 or 3 of his old veterans expressed a desire to return to France, he gave them their dismissal, and exhorted them to serve the good king. These were his own words, of that I am certain." "Well, Blacas, what do you think of this?" inquired the king triumphantly, and pausing for a moment from the voluminous scholiast before him. "I say, sire, that the minister of police is greatly deceived, or I am; and as it is impossible it can be the minister of police, as he has the guardianship of the safety and honor of your majesty, it is probable that I am in error. However, sire, if I might advise, your majesty will interrogate the person of whom I spoke to you, and I will urge your majesty to do him this honor." "Most willingly, duke; under your auspices I will receive any person you please, but you must not expect me to be too confiding. Baron, have you any report more recent than this, dated the 20th February? This is the 4th of March." "No, sire, but I am hourly expecting one. It may have arrived since I left my office." "Go thither, and if there be none, well, well," continued Louis XVIII., "make one. That is the usual way, is it not?" And the king laughed facetiously. "Oh, sire," replied the minister, "we have no occasion to invent any. Every day our desks are loaded with the most circumstantial denunciations, coming from hosts of people who hope for some return for services which they seek to render but cannot. They trust to fortune, and rely upon some unexpected event in some way to justify their predictions." "Well, sir, go," said Louis XVIII., "and remember that I am waiting for you." "I will but go and return, sire. I shall be back in 10 minutes." "And I, sire," said M. de Blacas, "will go and find my messenger." "Wait, sir, wait," said Louis XVIII. "Really, M. de Blacas, I must change your armorial bearings. I will give you an eagle with outstretched wings, holding in its claws a prey which tries in vain to escape, and bearing this device, 'Tenax.'" "Sire, I listen," said de Blacas, biting his nails with impatience. "I wish to consult you on this passage: 'Molli fugiens angelitu.' You know it refers to a stag flying from a wolf. Are you not a sportsman and a great wolf hunter?"
"Well, then, what do you think of the Molli Angelitu?"
"Admirable, sire; but my messenger is like the stag you refer to, for he has posted 220 leagues in scarcely 3 days." "Which is undergoing great fatigue and anxiety, my dear duke. when we have a telegraph which transmits messages in 3 or 4 hours, and that without getting in the least out of breath? Ah, sire, you recompense but badly this poor young man, who has come so far, and with so much ardor, to give your majesty useful information. If only for the sake of M. de Salvieux, who recommends him to me, I entreat your majesty to receive him graciously." "M. de Salvieux, my brother's chamberlain?" "Yes, sire." "He is at Marseilles." "And writes me thence. Does he speak to you of this conspiracy?" "No, but strongly recommends M. de Villefort, and begs me to present him to your majesty." "M. de Villefort!" cried the king. "Is the messenger's name M. de Villefort?" "Yes, sire." "And he comes from Marseilles?" "In person." "Why did you not mention his name at once?" replied the king, betraying some uneasiness. "Sire, I thought his name was unknown to your majesty." "No, no, Blacas. He is a man of strong and elevated understanding, ambitious too. And pardieu, you know his father's name?" "His father?" "Yes, Noirtier." "Noirtier the Girondin? Noirtier the senator?" "He himself." "And your majesty has employed the son of such a man?" "Blacas, my friend, you have but limited comprehension. I told you Villefort was ambitious, and to attain this ambition Villefort would sacrifice everything, even his father. Then, sire, may I present him?" "This instant, duke. Where is he?" "Waiting below in my carriage." "Seek him at once." I hastened to do so. The duke left the royal presence with the speed of a young man. His really sincere royalism made him youthful again. Louis XVIII. Remained alone, and turning his eyes on his half opened Horace, muttered, "Justum et tenacem propositi virum." M. de Blacas returned as speedily as he had departed, but in the antechamber he was forced to appeal to the king's authority. Villefort's dusty garb, his costume, which was not of courtly cut, excited the susceptibility of M. Debray, who was all astonishment at finding that this young man had the audacity to enter before the king in such attire. The duke, however, overcame all difficulties with a word, "His majesty's order," and, in spite of the protestations which the master of ceremonies made for the honor of his office and principles, Villefort was introduced. The king was seated in the same place where the duke had left him. On opening the door, Villefort found himself facing him, and the young magistrate's first impulse was to pause. "Come in, M. de Villefort," said the king, "come in." Villefort bowed, and advancing a few steps, waited until the king should interrogate him. "M. de Villefort," said Louis XVIII., "the Duc de Blacas assures me you have some interesting information to communicate." "Sire, the duke is right, and I believe your majesty will think it equally important. In the first place, and before everything else, sir, is the news as bad in your opinion as I am asked to believe?" "Sire, I believe it to be most urgent, but I hope, by the speed I have used, that it is not irreparable." "Speak as fully as you please, sir," said the king, who began to give way to the emotion which had showed itself in Blacas's face, and affected Villefort's voice. "Speak, sir, and pray begin at the beginning. I like order in everything." "Sire," said Villefort, "I will render a faithful report to your majesty, but I must entreat your forgiveness if my anxiety leads to some obscurity in my language." A glance at the king, after this discreet and subtle exordium, assured Villefort of the benignity of his august auditor, and he went on: "Sire, I have come as rapidly to Paris as possible to inform your majesty that I have discovered, in the exercise of my duties, not a commonplace and insignificant plot, such as is every day got up in the lower ranks of the people and in the army, but an actual conspiracy, a storm which menaces no less than your majesty's throne. Sire, the usurper is arming 3 ships; he meditates some project, which, however mad, is yet, perhaps, terrible. At this moment he will have left Elba to go whither I know not, but assuredly to attempt a landing either at Naples or on the coast of Tuscany, or perhaps on the shores of France. Your majesty is well aware that the sovereign of the island of Elba has maintained his relations with Italy and France. "I am, sir," said the king, much agitated; "and recently we have had information that the Bonapartist clubs have had meetings in the Rue Saint Jacques. But proceed, I beg of you. How did you obtain these details?" "Sire, they are the results of an examination which I have made of a man of Marseilles, whom I have watched for some time, and arrested on the day of my departure. This person, a sailor of turbulent character, and whom I suspected of Bonapartism, has been secretly to the island of Elba. There he saw the grand marshal, who charged him with an oral message to a Bonapartist in Paris, whose name I could not extract from him. But this mission was to prepare men's minds for a return. It is the man who says this, sire, a return which will soon occur." "And where is this man?" "In prison, sire." "And the matter seems serious to you?" "So serious, sire, that when the circumstance surprised me in the midst of a family festival, on the very day of my betrothal, I left my bride and friends, postponing everything, that I might hasten to lay at your majesty's feet the fears which impressed me and the assurance of my devotion."
"True," said Louis XVIII.
"Was there not a marriage engagement between you and Mademoiselle de Saint Méran?" "Daughter of one of your majesty's most faithful servants." "Yes, yes; but let us talk of this plot, M. Villefort." "Sire, I fear it is more than a plot; I fear it is a conspiracy."
"A conspiracy in these times," said Louis XVIII., smiling, "is a thing very easy to meditate, but more difficult to conduct to an end,
inasmuch as, re-established so recently on the throne of our ancestors, we have our eyes open at once upon the past, the present, and the future. For the last 10 months my ministers have redoubled their vigilance in order to watch the shores of the Mediterranean. If Bonaparte landed at Naples, the whole coalition would be on foot before he could even reach Piombino. If he land in Tuscany, he will be in an unfriendly territory.
if he land in France, it must be with a handful of men, and the result of that is easily foretold, execrated as he is by the population. Take courage, sir, but at the same time rely on our royal gratitude."
"Ah, here is M. Dandré," cried de Blacas. At this instant the minister of police appeared at the door, pale, trembling, and as if ready to faint. Villefort was about to retire, but M. de Blacas, taking his hand, restrained him. Chapter 11.
Of the Count of Monte Cristo. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Count of Monte Cristo by Alexandre Dumas. Chapter 11. The Corsican Ogre. At the sight of this agitation, Louis XVIII. pushed from him violently the table at which he was sitting. "What ails you, baron?" he exclaimed. "You appear quite aghast. Has your uneasiness anything to do with what M. de Blacas has told me, and what M. de Villefort has just confirmed?" M. de Blacas moved suddenly towards the baron, but the fright of the courtier pleaded for the forbearance of the statesman; and besides, as matters were, it was much more to his advantage that the prefect of police should triumph over him than that he should humiliate the prefect. "Sire," stammered the baron. "Well, what is it?" asked Louis XVIII. The minister of police, giving way to an impulse of despair, was about to throw himself at the feet of Louis XVIII., who retreated a step and frowned. "Will you speak?" he said. "Oh, sire, what a dreadful misfortune! I am, indeed, to be pitied. I can never forgive myself." "Monsieur," said Louis XVIII., "I command you to speak." "Well, sire, the usurper left Elba on the 26th February, and landed on the 1st of March." "And where? In Italy?" asked the king eagerly. "In France, sire, at a small port near Antibes, in the Gulf of Juan." "The usurper landed in France near Antibes, in the Gulf of Juan, 250 leagues from Paris, on the 1st of March, and you only acquired this information today, the 4th of March?" "Well, sir, what you tell me is impossible. You must have received a false report, or you have gone mad." "Alas, sire, it is but too true." Louis made a gesture of indescribable anger and alarm, and then drew himself up as if this sudden blow had struck him at the same moment in heart and countenance. "In France!" he cried. "The usurper in France! Then they did not watch over this man. Who knows? They were perhaps in league with him." "Oh, sire," exclaimed the Duc de Blacas, "M. Dandré is not a man to be accused of treason. Sire, we have all been blind, and the minister of police has shared the general blindness, that is all." "But," said Villefort, and then suddenly checking himself, he was silent. Then he continued, "Your pardon, sire," he said, bowing, "my zeal carried me away. Will your majesty deign to excuse me?" "Speak, sir, speak boldly," replied Louis. "You alone forewarned us of the evil, now try and aid us with the remedy." "Sire," said Villefort, "the usurper is detested in the south, and it seems to me that if he ventured into the south it would be easy to raise Languedoc and Provence against him." "Yes, assuredly," replied the minister, "but he is advancing by Gap and Sisteron." "Advancing? He is advancing?" said Louis XVIII. "Is he then advancing on Paris?" The minister of police maintained a silence which was equivalent to a complete avowal. "And Dauphine, sir?" inquired the king of Villefort. "Do you think it possible to rouse that as well as Provence?" "Sire, I am sorry to tell your majesty a cruel fact, but the feeling in Dauphine is quite the reverse of that in Provence or Languedoc. The mountaineers are Bonapartists, sire." "Then," murmured Louis, "he was well informed. And how many men had he with him?" "I do not know, sire," answered the minister of police. "What, you do not know? Have you neglected to obtain information on that point? Of course, it is of no consequence," he said, with a withering smile. "Sire, it was impossible to learn. The despatch simply stated the fact of the landing and the route taken by the usurper." "And how did this despatch reach you?" The minister bowed his head, and while a deep color overspread his cheeks, he stammered out, "By the telegraph, sire." Louis XVIII. advanced a step, and folded his arms over his chest as Napoleon would have done. "So, then," he exclaimed, turning pale with anger, 7 conjoined and allied armies overthrew that man. A miracle of heaven replaced me on the throne of my fathers after 25 years of exile. I have during those 25 years spared no pains to understand the people of France and the interests which were confided to me, and now, when I see the fruition of my wishes almost within my reach, the power I hold in my hands bursts and shatters me to atoms." "Sire, it is fatality," murmured the minister, feeling that the pressure of circumstances, however light a thing to destiny, was too much for any human strength to endure. "What our enemies say of us is then true. We have learnt nothing, forgotten nothing. If I were betrayed as he was, I would console myself; but to be in the midst of persons elevated by myself to places of honor, who ought to watch over me more carefully than over themselves, for my fortune is theirs. Before me they were nothing, after me they will be nothing, and perish miserably from incapacity, ineptitude. Oh, yes, sir, you are right, it is fatality." The minister quailed before this outburst of sarcasm. M. de Blacas wiped the moisture from his brow. Villefort smiled within himself, for he felt his increased importance. "To fall," continued King Louis, who at the first glance had sounded the abyss on which the monarchy hung suspended, "to fall, and to learn of that fall by telegraph! Oh, I would rather mount the scaffold of my brother, Louis XVI., than thus descend the staircase at the Tuileries, driven away by ridicule. Ridicule, sir! Why, you know not its power in France, and yet you ought to know it." "Sire, sire," murmured the minister, "for pity's——" "Approach, M. de Villefort," resumed the king, addressing the young man, who, motionless and breathless, was listening to a conversation on which depended the destiny of a kingdom. Approach, and tell monsieur that it is possible to know beforehand all that he has not known." "Sire, it really was impossible to learn secrets which that man concealed from all the world." "Really impossible? Yes, that is a great word, sir. Unfortunately, there are great words as there are great men. I have measured them. Really impossible for a minister who has an office, agents, spies, and 1,500,000 francs for secret service money, to know what is going on at 60 leagues from the coast of France? Well, then, see, here is a gentleman who had none of those resources at his disposal, a gentleman, only a simple magistrate, who learned more than you with all your police, and who would have saved my crown if, like you, he had the power of directing a telegraph." The look of the minister of police was turned with concentrated spite on Villefort, who bent his head in modest triumph. "I do not mean that for you, Blacas," continued Louis XVIII., "for if you have discovered nothing, at least you have had the good sense to persevere in your suspicions. Any other than yourself would have considered the disclosure of M. de Villefort insignificant, or else dictated by venal ambition." These words were an allusion to the sentiments which the minister of police had uttered with so much confidence an hour before. Villefort understood the king's intent. Any other person would, perhaps, have been overcome by such an intoxicating draught of praise, but he feared to make for himself a mortal enemy of the police minister, although he saw that Dandré was irrevocably lost. In fact, the minister, who in the plenitude of his power had been unable to unearth Napoleon's secret, might in despair at his own downfall interrogate Dantès, and so lay bare the motives of Villefort's plot. Realizing this, Villefort came to the rescue of the crestfallen minister, instead of aiding to crush him. "Sire," said Villefort, "the suddenness of this event must prove to your majesty that the issue is in the hands of Providence. What your majesty is pleased to attribute to me as profound perspicacity is simply owing to chance, and I have profited by that chance, like a good and devoted servant. That's all. Do not attribute to me more than I deserve, sire, that your majesty may never have occasion to recall the first opinion you have been pleased to form of me." The minister of police thanked the young man by an eloquent look, and Villefort understood that he had succeeded in his design; that is to say, that without forfeiting the gratitude of the king, he had made a friend of one on whom, in case of necessity, he might rely. "'Tis well," resumed the king. "And now, gentlemen," he continued toward M. de Blacas and the minister of police, "I have no further occasion for you, and you may retire. What now remains to do is in the department of the minister of war." "Fortunately, sire," said M. de Blacas, "we can rely on the army. Your majesty knows how every report confirms their loyalty and attachment." "Do not mention reports, duke, to me, for I know now what confidence to place in them. Yet, speaking of reports, baron, what have you learned with regard to the affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques?" "The affair in the Rue Saint-Jacques!" exclaimed Villefort, unable to repress an exclamation. Then, suddenly pausing, he added, "Your pardon, sire, but my devotion to your majesty has made me forget, not the respect I have, for that is too deeply engraved in my heart, but the rules of etiquette." Go on, sir," replied the king; "you have today earned the right to make inquiries here." "Sire," interposed the minister of police, "I came a moment ago to give your majesty fresh information which I had obtained on this head, when your majesty's attention was attracted by the terrible event that has occurred in the Gulf, and now these facts will cease to interest your majesty." "On the contrary, sir, on the contrary," said Louis XVIII., "this affair seems to me to have a decided connection with that which occupies our attention, and the death of General Quesnel will, perhaps, put us on the direct track of a great internal conspiracy." At the name of General Quesnel, Villefort trembled. "Everything points to the conclusion, sire," said the minister of police, "that death was not the result of suicide, as we first believed, but of assassination. General Quesnel, it appears, had just left a Bonapartist club when he disappeared. An unknown person had been with him that morning, and made an appointment with him in the Rue Saint-Jacques. Unfortunately, the general's valet, who was dressing his hair at the moment when the stranger entered, heard the street mentioned, but he did not catch the number. As the police minister related this to the king, Villefort, who looked as if his very life hung on the speaker's lips, turned alternately red and pale. The king looked toward him.
Do you not think with me, M. de Villefort, that General Quesnel, whom they believed attached to the usurper, but who was really entirely devoted to me, has perished the victim of a Bonapartist ambush?"
"It is probable, sire," replied Villefort; "but is this all that is known?" "They are on the track of the man who appointed the meeting with him." "On his track?" said Villefort. "Yes, the servant has given his description. He was a man of from 50 to 52 years of age, dark, with black eyes, covered with shaggy eyebrows and a thick moustache. He was dressed in a blue frock coat, buttoned up to the chin, and wore at his buttonhole the rosette of an officer of the Legion of Honor. Yesterday a person exactly corresponding with this description was followed,
But he was lost sight of at the corner of the Rue de la Jussienne and the Rue Coq
Villefort leaned on the back of an armchair, for as the minister of police went on speaking, he felt his legs bend under him. But when he learned that the unknown had escaped the vigilance of the agent who followed him, he breathed again. "Continue to seek for this man, sir," said the king to the minister of police.
For if, as I am all but convinced, General Quesnel, who would have been so useful to us at this moment, has been murdered, his assassins, Bonapartists or not, shall be cruelly punished."
It required all Villefort's coolness not to betray the terror with which this declaration of the king inspired him. "How strange," continued the king with some asperity. "The police think that they have disposed of the whole matter, when they say, 'A murder has been committed,' and especially so when they can add, 'and we are on the track of the guilty persons.' Sire, your majesty will, I trust, be amply satisfied on this point at least." "We shall see. I will no longer detain you, M. de Villefort, for you must be fatigued after so long a journey.
Go and rest. Of course you stopped at your father's?"
A feeling of faintness came over Villefort. "No, sire, I alighted at the Hôtel de Madrid, in the Rue de Tournon." "But you have seen him?" "Sire, I went straight to the Duc de Blacas." "But will you see him, then?" "I think not, sire." "Ah, I forgot," said Louis, smiling in a manner which proved that all these questions were not made without a motive, "I forgot that you and M. Noirtier are not on the best terms possible, and that is another sacrifice made to the royal cause, and for which you should be recompensed." "Sire, the kindness your majesty deigns to evince towards me is a recompense which so far surpasses my utmost ambition that I have nothing more to ask for." "Never mind, sir, we will not forget you. Make your mind easy. In the meanwhile," the king here detached the cross of the Legion of Honor, which he usually wore over his blue coat, near the cross of St. Louis, above the order of Notre Dame du Mont Carmel and St. Lazare, and gave it to Villefort. "In the meanwhile, take this cross." "Sire," said Villefort, "your majesty mistakes; this is an officer's cross." "Ma foi," said Louis XVIII., "take it, such as it is, for I have not the time to procure you another. Blacas, let it be your care to see that the brevet is made out and sent to M. de Villefort." Villefort's eyes were filled with tears of joy and pride. He took the cross and kissed it. "And now," he said, "may I inquire what are the orders with which your majesty deigns to honor me?" "Take what rest you require, and remember that if you are not able to serve me here in Paris, you may be of the greatest service to me at Marseilles." "Sire," replied Villefort, bowing, "in an hour I shall have quitted Paris." "Go, sir," said the king, "and should I forget you—kings' memories are short—do not be afraid to bring yourself to my recollection. Baron, send for the minister of war. Blacas, remain." "Ah, sir," said the minister of police to Villefort as they left the Tuileries, "you entered by luck's door. Your fortune is made." "Will it be long first?"
muttered Villefort, saluting the minister, whose career was ended, and looking about him for a hackney coach. One passed at the moment, which he hailed. He gave his address to the driver, and springing in, threw himself on the seat, and gave loose to dreams of ambition. 10 minutes afterwards Villefort reached his hotel, ordered horses to be ready in 2 hours, and asked to have his breakfast brought to him. He was about to begin his repast when the sound of the bell rang sharp and loud. The valet opened the door, and Villefort heard someone speak his name. "Who could know that I was here already?" said the young man. The valet entered. "Well," said Villefort, "what is it? Who rang? Who asked for me?" "A stranger who will not send in his name." "A stranger who will not send in his name? What can he want with me?" "He wishes to speak to you." "To me?" "Yes." "Did he mention my name?" "Yes." "What sort of person is he?" "Why, sir, a man of about 50. "Short or tall?" "About your own height, sir." "Dark or fair?" "Dark, very dark, with black eyes, black hair, black eyebrows." "And how dressed?" asked Villefort quickly. "In a blue frock coat, buttoned up close, decorated with the Legion of Honor." "It is he," said Villefort, turning pale. "Eh, pardieu!" said the individual whose description we have twice given, entering the door. "What a great deal of ceremony! Is it the custom in Marseilles for sons to keep their fathers waiting in their anterooms?" "Father!" cried Villefort. "Then I was not deceived. I felt sure it must be you." "Well, then, if you felt so sure," replied the newcomer, putting his cane in a corner and his hat on a chair, "allow me to say, my dear Gérard, that it was not very filial of you to keep me waiting at the door." "Leave us, Germain," said Villefort. The servant quitted the apartment with evident signs of astonishment. Chapter 12.